Hey there, welcome to Takeaway with Sam Okus, a podcast from Nation's Restaurant News. I am Sam Okus, editor-in-chief here at NRN, and this is the show where I give you an all-access pass to the restaurant industry's most influential decision makers. This week I'm sharing two conversations that I recently had as part of our reporting for The Power List, which featured some of the restaurant industry's most intriguing marketers and influencers. Dan Baymuck is the CEO and co-founder of the marketing firm Dreambox, and Lena Katz is principal creative with Variable Content. Dan and Lena each work closely with social media influencers, and as we were compiling the Power List, we consulted with each of them to learn more about how restaurant leaders can properly leverage influencer marketing and which influencers in particular were making waves in the restaurant industry. First up, Dan shares some thoughts about why restaurants should consider influencer marketing, plus some do's and don'ts in building a campaign. And later, Lena really gets in the weeds on how business owners can construct an influencer campaign and what they should expect out of it. Jumping now into my conversations, first with Dan Baymuck of Dreambox, and then with Lena Katz of Variable Content. Enjoy the conversations. So Dan, we're going to talk about influencer marketing, which is on everybody's lips, of course. This is the hot new thing for marketing.
Yep.
You know a thing or two about marketing yourself. At Dreambox, this is what you guys do. And so I wanted to get in touch with you to learn more about influencers and how they can be effective marketing tools, for lack of a better term, for the restaurant industry. So let's just start with, influence and influencers. What are we talking about when we talk about influence and influencers?
It's such an interesting question. We spend a lot of time looking, are we talking about culinary influence? Are we talking about cultural influence? Are we talking about people that can drive guest traffic? All these different pieces that make their way into what ultimately we all label as influencers, people that are having an impact on our industry. And one of the interesting challenges is trying to go and recognize that we have such a large potential pool of people that they themselves self-identify as influencers. Well, starting to go and sift through that and figure out, well, who really does have an impact on how guests are going to behave, how restaurants are going to design the interior of their stores, how culinary teams are going to design menu items that have a little bit more of a potentially viral or shareable component to them. That's what really starts to make its way into this idea of influence that gets our attention from an agency standpoint. And when we look at people in the space, that we really try to not only see what they're doing from an impact perspective, but where this means long term. If a brand partners with someone and they bring someone into a store, what's the potential risk? What's the upside? Where can this potentially go? That's what really keeps our team interested in this influencer world. And it's certainly never boring. You get surprised sometimes in good ways, sometimes in interesting ways. And part of the real the secret sauce to be able to make sure that pieces like this from an influencer marketing standpoint work well is research, having the solid understanding of who we're matching with a specific brand, having also the perspective on teeing them up for success if it's something that you bring an influencer into a brand, why are we doing it? Are we bringing them in just to be able to go and say, hey, I ate at this restaurant? Because that's probably questionable influence. If an influencer, though, is starting to look at a segment and starting to really communicate to their audience, their people that these are my people, if they're able to do something that really helps to shape a perspective that the guest population has around what type of food, what type of pairings, there are so many people right now in the space that are doing things in all these different areas. It's probably one of the most interesting matchups that we've ever seen. Dreambox has been around for 25 years, and so we've seen before there was social media, what did digital look like back then? Social media comes around. What does it really mean then as a tool to be able to grow restaurant brands? And the most interesting part of the influencer space is the release of control. That's the part that is probably the most, maybe a little nerve-wracking, but also exciting, because when you bring an influencer into your fold, you're essentially saying to someone, we think that you're so great, and we think that our audience thinks you're so great, that we'd like to potentially do something. You look at the collaborations that brands are doing now, and I'm not just talking about McDonald's and doing big global collaborations, but you look at how smaller brands are collaborating in ways that really are connecting people that have interests, perspectives, audiences, and doing something that folks look around and say, Yeah, those are my people. I want to be a part of that. That's really where we see influence shining.
Yeah. Well, and to that point, picking an influencer, obviously these influencers, some of them you can say, oh, well, look at their reach. I mean, they've got millions of
Yeah.
views. Boom, right there. That's the influencer I want
Yep.
to work with. But I'm sure it's not so easy. So in this process, this matchmaking process of restaurant brand to influencer, and also, by the way, taking into account when when we say influencer, you imagine a million followers, but that really could be even
Yeah.
just a couple thousand followers, but in a very specific niche or in a very
Yeah.
specific region. So in this process of matchmaking brands to influencer, what are some things you would suggest to restaurant brands for finding that right influencer?
I think the first part, one of the ways that we find influencers a lot is an influencer comes to a brand and they are such fans already of a concept that they're already putting their own content out before we've even spoken to them. And that right away starts to develop this reality where the guest is already someone that has, effectively drank the Kool-Aid. We don't need to show them why this brand is special. We just want to give them a platform to be able to really amplify their message. That's one piece that's certainly extremely helpful is paying attention to when influencer, and most brands are aware of this obviously, but staying ahead of it. So when there is talk of an influencer coming in, being able to be extremely prepared, being able to also potentially have additional eyeballs on what may happen while they're in store. And a lot of times that can mean having a team member out in store, potentially being able to do some behind the scenes of the influencer themselves. There's certainly parts that have a staying power beyond content that the influencer themselves puts out. But this pairing, certainly when you have people that have an affinity for a brand, that's remarkable because then you know already this whole idea as brand marketers, we're always trying to reinforce this notion of these are my people. Well, if we have someone that's already a fan of our brand, we're already 10 steps ahead if we don't need to try to match an influencer because we would love to be able to reach their audience with a brand that they may not have any interest in. There was a
Right.
Bad Bunny had a post about 2 years ago where he posted himself eating some pizza. And he came out while he was eating in Spanish. He says, "This is the greatest pizza I've ever eaten. But because this brand didn't pay me anything, I'm not going to say who it is." And you saw all these comments from all these pizza brands coming in and saying, "I think it's ours. I think it's ours. I think it's ours." And it was such an interesting part because there you have someone that's a fan of a specific product. He's trying to make that a little bit more transactional, but it was still
Right.
something that to have that visibility and that chance to be able to leverage the individual as a human being, their affinity for what a product is serving or what a brand is serving, that's what really turns into a really spectacular collaboration. And those are the kind of influencer partnerships that we love. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes you have brands where you'd love to be able to reach an audience, and especially if you're in a market where you an extremely noisy market.
That's such an interesting part too, because I think about this sort of algorithmic nature of Instagram and TikTok, especially, and how, in my opinion, it feels like it makes a lot of the content homogenous. Now, to its credit, it's constantly changing. Again, what I was saying before, where
Yeah.
like all of a sudden one day everybody's doing the same video, and then the next day everybody's doing the same video.
Yeah.
And what that it makes me wonder is like for a restaurant brand, I mean, how much resources should a restaurant put against social media in general? Because for example, I got the chance to tour Chipotle's headquarters once, and I was shown their social media war room. And genuinely, I mean, you would have thought it was a presidential campaign for how many people are in this war room paying attention to social media, who's saying what on social media, what are the influencers doing. But, that's Chipotle. You can't do that with every brand. So I guess my question ultimately is, what should a brand expect to commit to this resource wise, whether that's what they're paying influencers, staffing that they're hiring to be paying attention to all this? How much should they ultimately commit to it?
Well, there's an interesting dynamic here that I could answer your question from a corporate standpoint, but I'm going to first step back
Mhm.
into the in-store experience. I don't think that we can talk about influence without talking about the Keith Lee effect. And you look at Keith Lee, a
Mhm.
guy that comes in 15 million followers on TikTok, a guy that comes into restaurants, small independent restaurants, and he's an honest guy. If he loves the experience, he'll share it. If he doesn't love the experience, he lets you know. There's a being ready for what could happen perspective that absolutely, from being buttoned up operationally, from being able to not only support every guest, ultimately making the experience for everyone better, but then looking at, well, what happens if things don't go great? What are we going to do about it? Then you get into sort of the reputation management, risk mitigation component that you described. And from a corporate standpoint, having the energy that and the time that goes into teen and influencer up for success, a lot of this comes into making sure, obviously, you get into some low-hanging fruit, making sure that we've got our A team on staff that day, making sure that we have them from a food prep standpoint, that this is something that's being made to spec, that we have items that also are being turned around quickly enough that the experience for the influencer isn't something where they're waiting. If there's any reason for them to complain, they're going to, and that's the risk that we take. And so being able to also tee them up so that they can have something that they walk away and they feel as though we've really rolled out the red carpet for them. That's especially when you have a collaboration perspective happening. Those are elements that we really see being successful.
Yeah, the cynic in me is like, that's not fair to the restaurant to put the restaurant in that position. And we've seen that for example, with Yelp. It's like you got to this point where Yelp reviewers, it felt like they were holding restaurants hostage by saying, I'm going to post a bad review unless you do this for me or whatever. But I also understand how this relationship is reciprocated. And I'm really glad you brought up Keith Lee, because, our hypothesis in launching the Power List this year around marketing and influence was around this notion that 2024 is really the year of marketing, because, as we see it, with traffic trends really down, traffic is trending down. The restaurant brands are really looking for ways to turn that around. And of course, there have been these celebrity partnerships, there have been deals, and there's been a lot more of these marketing initiatives, particularly influencer marketing initiatives. So that's kind of how this all got, launched initially. And Keith Lee is such a great example of, I was looking through his content and seeing how he goes to these mom and pop restaurants, especially, that don't get anybody. Like, they're getting barely anybody coming in their doors. Yeah. And then the next day there's a line around the block. So a very clear example of how Keith Lee is leading to this incredible ROI. It genuinely is reversing this traffic for some of these restaurants, literally creating traffic where there was none. Yep. Do you think influencer marketing is a good lever for turning customer traffic around?
Boy, it's an interesting, there's a sustainability question to it. You look at different elements in a restaurant's life cycle where you have manufactured guest traffic. The grand opening is a great example, where it's like, oh, we're going to have and you have the honeymoon period. You've got a few months after opening where, all right, let's see how we're performing. And then reality starts to sink in. And reality starts to sink in could mean a whole bunch of soul searching around, all right, well, what did we do during the grand opening that made this so big that we're no longer continuing? Well, a lot of that was the grand opening itself, the fact that we have something that's new, that people can come and try it. This question around sustainability of influencer marketing, you can have like these operational headaches around, well, how am I going to staff for that day when you talk about the mom and pops, they may have 2 people working that day. And all of a sudden they realize, oh my God, 2 people. No, we need our whole team of 10 working today. And they may have other jobs. So it's okay, well, which ones are they going to? These are these little operational questions that are so integral to being able to really thrive when there is an influencer virality moment. These are pieces that can blow up in a good way. They can also fizzle in a bad way. One of the pieces that when you talk about the year of marketing, as someone that pays his bills from running a marketing agency, this is near and dear to me. But one of the absolute components that we see as so fundamental to this is when those moments happen, and they may be manufactured like a grand opening. They may be something that's influencer driven from surprise, because we've had it happen also where we had a client, Tom Brady, happened to mention one of our clients on a podcast last year. And it was just out of the blue. It was, oh, wow, thank you, sir. We appreciate that. and so that was a fun little surprise moment that, of course, as marketers, you jump on. But beyond that, seeing how these can remain sustainable goes back to sort of core foundational elements of restaurant marketing. Do we have a real solid perspective on what remarketing means? How are we going to retain these guests? How are we going to continue to invite them back in? What are we doing from a profitability standpoint to make sure that when they come in that they may buy a lot of food, but are they actually making us money? All these different elements that come into running a successful solvent business. It's the part that always makes me cry a little tear when I see on a local city that I live in Facebook group of some beloved restaurant closing, and people say, "Oh no, why are you
Hmm.
closing?" I think to myself, well, had you spent more money at that restaurant, they'd probably still be open. And these are
That's
the
right.
financial challenges that at the end of the day, while we, it's one of the reasons why personally I love working in this industry, is we get to work in an industry that's celebratory, where people, they feel nourished,
Yeah.
they feel warm in their belly. This is something that we all get to be a part of. And you look at restaurants that, whether it's a mom and pop, whether it's a multi-unit brand, these are all effectively meeting places for people within a community. And you think about, what does this mean for someone that brings an influencer in? You may have this bump, the Keith Lee effect. What are you going to do about it long term? Well, in an ideal perspective, for one, you'd do everything you can to leverage when those guests are there those days. So your menu's buttoned up from a profitability standpoint. Your restaurant's well executing so that guests walk away saying, "I'm so glad I tried this." The team is fully trained on how to be able to handle these excessive rushes of guests. And sometimes they get intense. It was funny. Keith Lee went to an empanada restaurant in Arizona that they had to close 3 times in one day, the day after he came in, because the team was burnt out and out of food. And,
Jeez.
we're not used
Wow.
to this. We have to stop. 3 times in one day they had to
Yeah.
close. But you look at also this notion of what so many companies now in the MarTech space are doing. This idea of the year of marketing, every loyalty program vendor that's hanging their hat on RFM and trying to go through and bring people back in and try to monetize them and getting them in as often as possible. All these different elements that make their way into proper business practices from a marketing standpoint, getting people in the door, taking care of them, making sure you can continue to reach out to them, making sure that there's a way to be able to stay relevant in their lives, and most of all, being able to nail it from a process standpoint.
Yeah.
There's nothing more painful, and we've seen it. We've seen it from brands that get really excited. We had one client a few years ago that opened 3 restaurants. This was a smaller system. Opened 3 restaurants in one day. And the challenge with that is then you have your training team sort of spread thin on that one day. You have a great GM at each store that's really doing what they can to go and open and thrive. But opening 3 stores in one day can be a challenge, because then you get spread thin. And again,
Yeah.
to use Chipotle, who's I think opening a store every 2 days, like, to their credit, they can scale this. But smaller systems that try to go through too quickly and grow, or to try to too quickly support such an influx of business, that's where they can trip up. And it's this idea of sustainable growth is something that we really see as key to a profitable, long-term, successful business.
As we talk about influence, what do you feel like influence and influencers? I mean, set the tone for us as far as what this industry is. How would you define influence today and how it's being used, particularly for corporate America and restaurants?
Well, I think influencer, the word has gone through it went through a few years of definitely being a pejorative, and people didn't like it and didn't want to be associated with it, and perhaps rightfully so, because there was definitely a moment where influencers were just, I like to call it like pretty people being photographed, going about their lives and getting paid for it, which is annoying. So they didn't necessarily have any expertise or, any authority in whatever they were talking about. Certainly in restaurant, they would just go and eat and be like, here's me with a cheeseburger that I'm probably not going to finish. Take a photo, $10,000, please. That was the peak of what people hated. Things have really changed a lot since then. And you can credit many things. You can credit that people actually like experts to have expertise, that people like relatability, that they like a little bit of, truthfulness and content creation. All of these things have changed now, what we see as influencers. And so you have now influencers who are chefs, influencers who work elsewhere, in hospitality, influencers who might be farmers, and have just managed to create a platform for themselves because they're good at storytelling, they're passionate about their topic, and people like to tune into them. So, that's great in terms of, that the industry is evolving this way. You also see now what they call behind the camera, or behind off-screen influencers. And that just means they're making content, they're making videos or photo or whatever, but you're not seeing them acting like, hi, I'm a QVC model here today. The old Food Network style of hosting hello audience, that is going away. You're seeing more sort of creative presentations of content, of locations, whatever. So a lot of the bigger influencers that are working for restaurants and stuff today, they might be doing special effects. They might be doing animated pieces, something like that. That's another type of influencer altogether who could do some sort of spotlight on your venue or on your product. They're not in there at all. It is truly about your venue or your product. And so I think that's really exciting for, for people in business today. And all of the ways that this is going are exciting. And also, we haven't touched on it yet, but I know this is going to be a big part of what we talk about. Influence is kind of niching down to like, they're saying macro influencers aren't really effective anymore. It's about reaching a specific community of people. And, that reflects kind of like the community newspapers of old, so we're also seeing a lot of that.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I'm glad you brought that up because look, I'm not a big social media guy. I have a TikTok account mostly just to see what's going on. But I imagine, if I'm a restaurant operator and I'm saying to myself, okay, here I got to use influencers. Let me check this out and see what it's all about. It's overwhelming. I mean, when you look into influencers and influence, there's just so much out there. It's hard to really know what exactly how to activate a campaign with an influencer. And of course, I also know it's changing constantly and very dependent on the algorithm. So to your point, I guess starting with what's your suggestion for how restaurants should look for influencers to help them promote their brand? Because to your point, you can go look for somebody with 10 million followers because you think it's the biggest reach, but that might not be the smartest strategy. So what do you think are some first steps a restaurant might take when looking for the right influencers?
Well, restaurants are, you ultimately want to get people in the door, right? You want to drive sales, and you need to do it, therefore, thinking regionally or locally around where are these venues, and then who is going to drive traffic to these venues. And so a lot of times, unless you're a national chain, on every single corner, maybe influencers that are macro and known at a national level are not the right fit for you. So where a lot of people get tripped up is they're like, okay, then what is the most influencer I can afford for my budget? So if I don't have $20,000 to afford this big influencer, should I get one that's half as big because I have half the money, or should I get one that's a quarter as big? You cannot think like that. Mm-hmm. What you should be thinking of is, who's big in your area. And it's not just, it doesn't need to be a guessing game. You can literally like look it up, like if you look into the back end of a lot of these different third-party tools or TikTok Creator Marketplace, it'll tell you, this person is posting out of Dallas and 70% of their traffic is, Texas. Okay, well, that tells you a lot. If you're a chain that's operating out of Texas and 2 other neighboring states, that's exactly what you want to be looking at. Then the other thing that you want to be looking at, for the back end, you would look at, okay, say they have 100,000 followers. How many video views are they getting per, what's their average video view count? So it doesn't matter if they have 100,000 followers if they're getting 3,000 video views. They might as well have 3,000 followers in that case. So you look at the follower count to sort of let you know, okay, this person, exists and has a footprint, right? You look at the video views to tell you how many people are actually tuning into the content on a regular basis. Then there's other things you can look at. Engagement, but likes can be bought. So a lot of people look at comments. Another thing to look at is who's watching the video through 6 seconds, or like 3, 6, all the way through, and then repeat views. Because the people that are watching past 6 seconds are probably tuned in, somewhat committed, and are getting the messaging that you're trying to convey to them. People that are watching all the way through are invested. The people that are watching on repeat, a lot of times, that's a trick. Like influencers you see, they throw a ton of stuff into a video and you're like, whoa, I didn't catch that. Like, I'm going to rewind it and watch it again. That is what they want you to do. Right. So, but maybe for a restaurant, you don't necessarily, you might want to like drop an Easter egg in there, whatever, to get people like watching. But really what you want to do is get your message out. Hey, 20% off on, Mondays, right at the top. So that people that are just there for that first 3 seconds are going to get that before they scroll on. But
Yeah.
then, ideally, like once they're in there for 6 seconds, then you've really got them. So you want to be looking for influencers that can do that, like
Yeah.
consistently, and that are in your local area and that are
hmm
aligned with your customer.
This is going to sound like a stupid question, but I do want to get a little in the weeds here. Is all of that information you just said, is that readily available? Or do you, when you approach an influencer, do you ask them for like their media kit or something? Like, how do you get that information?
Some media kits have it. It
hmm
depends on the tool. I just saw a tool. It's a great tool. I'm not shilling for it because I don't actually remember what it was called, but it was a portfolio that an agency had, and every single influencer, it showed their average video views on Instagram and TikTok. And I messaged them and I was like, where did you get that? And because most agencies do not provide that right up front, you kind of have to ask for it. But it was so helpful. It provided engagement rate is readily available. Everyone can provide it. But really, it's very easy to get a sense of average video views just by looking, like on TikTok, it'll show what the video views are. And then on Instagram, if you click on the Reels icon, it will show you the views across every single reel. So, there was a whole thing where influencers were hiding their like count. And that was, in some cases, to obscure lower engagement rates, like so you couldn't tell right away. But now you can just click over on a Reels and you see exactly how many people are watching, which is very helpful.
Gotcha.
So that's the first thing that you do when you're assessing an influencer based on specifically like reach, audience size, how many people is this going to get me in front of? Look at the views.
Right.
It's going to give you a very good sense right away of like how much of this person's, how many of the people they're following are, what percentage of that is actually active? How many people are they actually reaching? So based on that, sort of what size they are, what size their audience is. And then it becomes a negotiation based on that.
Right.
So for example, carrying on my hypothetical about the Texas influencer, right? Here we have somebody from Dallas with 500,000 followers. And then we have someone else from 20 miles away in Dallas with 100,000 followers. So the mistake that people make is, I want to see if I can afford the 500,000 follower person. No. What you do is you click over, check their Reels, check their TikTok video views, see who's actually getting, what are their actual like average video views looking like? And all of a sudden it might turn up that the 100,000 follower person is getting 80,000 views per video and the other one's only getting 12,000 views per video. Well, right away, all of a sudden 100,000 person moves up to the top ranking because first of all, you can get away with offering them a lower rate up front, but they are actually a higher value influencer. Then you drill down a little bit more, what's their engagement rate? How healthy is their comment section? Is there actual conversation going on? Then you go on the back end on your third-party tool or TikTok Creator Marketplace or, Instagram Marketplace, and you look at things like shares, things like how many people are saving the video, how many people are watching it through the 3-second mark, 6-second mark, all the way through. And there you start to build in your, the profile of like the performance profile, like how many, like what is their actual engaged audience who's tuning into these videos and really, really staying around for the content. Then if you want, you can start actually, you can talk to their manager and say, hey, can I get like a click-through report, on something they did? Or do you have anything that shows me, if they did a coupon code or something, can I see what the results were? A lot of times for restaurants, you might not necessarily want to go that extra step. Just because restaurants usually are not going to have people offering up a coupon code. It's too,
Right.
The logistics of it are difficult.
Right.
But that's how, when I'm looking at like, say 5 people side by side, and I know, that there is some sort of regional preference, this is how I do it. And also like, you also have to look at like, okay, what percentage of their followers are actually, what's the top 5 states that are tuning into them? Because if you get like, here's my person in Dallas, but all of their traffic is coming from Connecticut because they used to live in Connecticut, that would
Right.
be a mark against them.
Right.
I always like to say, like, it becomes when you're doing it that way, it becomes almost more of a math equation, right?
Yeah.
It's like it's less of a popularity contest and more of like a math problem.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned before we hit record that there are some influencers out there charging 5 and 6 figures per post potentially. And the reality is there are people out there who are just as creative and talented, who are going to be a lot more affordable, who, to your point, could be a lot more effective for you if you go that direction, not just from a budgetary standpoint, but even from a reach standpoint, right?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I always say what I said was for every influencer that you look at that came across your desk thanks to a travel and leisure piece that has a million followers and quotes you $25,000, I guarantee you standing right next to them is an influencer that is identical and is making almost identical content that isn't repped or that has a smaller rep and is charging a quarter of that. That happens to me every single campaign.
Wow.
Every single campaign.
Yeah.
And even now to this day, every single campaign I'm finding influencers that might have in the 200, 300,000 follower range who've never been paid before. So
Wow.
yeah, you're saying, oh, we could get micros. You don't even have to.
True.
You just keep looking at that, you just keep digging and the algorithm will keep surfacing people that it thinks you like because you walk past that 6-second mark. And you will get to those people that are like, posting regionally in their local city, just maybe used to be a waitress, cocktail, like a bartender, whatever, and have just been building their followings quietly, and have no representation. And if you offer them, $500,000 for a post, or come and be our regular, influencer content creator, come in a few times a month and we'll pay you X retainer. Like that's their dream. It's all they want.
Right. For sure. We've been talking about kind of the content of all of this. You've been, mentioning some of these things that the influencers do, but I am curious about that too. I mean, obviously, again, this stuff changes all the time because of the algorithm. But when I go in and I look through through a lot of the videos that these influencers are doing, I see a lot of sitting in my car, eating food, giving my opinion. Of course, there's a lot of, I'm going to go visit this restaurant now. I'm just curious, for again, a restaurant who wants to employ an influencer to support their brand, content wise, what seems to be the best kind of content that resonates today anyway?
I would say there's people, when I worked at TikTok, they were big on originators, and originators were people who created a trend that was so good that other people hopped on it. It's hard to track that because some of the best trends, especially dances, it's hard to say what one person originated them, right? It's kind of coming out of the hive mind. So with food, very similar. Like I couldn't say, first of all, like you said, people sitting in their car eating food. That really depends on the person. Like some people are going to just have a knack for that. There's a former public school teacher, a woman that became really, really famous a few years ago for that style. Now Keith Lee, very famous for that style, but not everybody can pull that off. Now, once one person gets famous for doing that, another 100,000 are going to copycat them.
Right.
You don't necessarily want to look for the best of the copycats, but I think, certain things that really pull in users and regular customers, like menu modifications and secret menu items, little bits of insider information, or like, here's a way you can super quickly doctor your food to make it better. Here's a way that you can order off the menu to, feel like you're getting a special experience. Those types of content usually do well, or they can get some momentum behind them without having the potential to go negative or get risky or get weird. There are, we've seen jingles. Like there was a girl that got very, very famous doing Starbucks jingles, right? So then there was a trend, everybody going in and singing their Starbucks order or singing it at the drive-through window. That's great, but you shouldn't copycat that as a brand. But then there are things like there's the, I saw the millennial, I'm your millennial manager, and there's the I'm your millennial manager at a coffee chain. I don't know if you saw that, but like
Mm-mm.
that's the kind of thing that as a brand, if you see that and you feel like we've got a person that can hop right into that, or we want to contact that influencer and have her do our version of this, um, that is definitely something that you could execute. Like that's
Yeah.
something realistic to execute.
Hmm.
And or like, there's the trend, I'm a millennial mom. Of course I do, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's a trend
Hmm.
that you can jump into as a food service chain. And if you personally, like, if you cannot do it, if you see a local influencer and you're talking to them about, okay, what kind of content are we going to do? And you know that this person is good at comedy, be like, do you think you could write a script like this for us? And then the next
Right.
question, could you turn it around in 48 hours? You don't want them doing it
Hmm.
after the trend is already dead.
You mentioned earlier in the conversation about sort of, you really connecting with specific communities, and you mentioned like millennial moms. I mean, it's a safe bet that if you jump on the trend of millennial moms, the audience that's watching that is primarily millennial moms, right? So, I mean, you use this to your advantage to say there's this trend, doing X, Y, and Z that's going to resonate with this type of demographic. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is it seems like restaurants do have to be very much laser focused on what is the core demographic they're trying to reach and finding the influencer that would connect with that demographic rather than kind of this sawed off shotgun approach of let's just get the highest reach and go for it, right?
Yeah, I think that's very, very true. And I think, you know, I think you don't need to overthink it. Like
Mm,
a lot of the successful influencer marketing programs being run by restaurant chains, they just take this, pretty simple formulaic approach of like, okay, we're going to look for people within this range, say 50 to 100,000 followers, and they're getting 25,000 views per video, and they've got a 6% engagement rate. They're in this age demographic, and they look like our customer. The next step is they've already posted about us before. That is the ideal, is that this person's
yeah.
already said something, complimentary about your restaurant once. They just make lists of those, reach out to those people, and sort of pull them into the program. And
Hmm.
it's simple,
Hmm.
and it is effective to a point. Like,
Hmm.
yes, if those people are posting 2 or 3 times a month, as long as they can do it creatively, it can be very effective. So, and it's just sort of, it's very simple, like I said, very by the book approach. The problem is if you do start getting people that are kind of what was the problem on Instagram, like 5 years ago they were getting a big head, and like, I don't pay for anything, I just get comped and whatever. And when audiences start getting that vibe, like this person doesn't even, like, they're not relatable, they don't live a regular life, they just get comped, and oh my god, I went into the restaurant when she was there and she was terrible. Like once that starts happening,
Right.
stops being as effective, because then people just start having negative associations, mostly with the influencer not thinking about the restaurant,
Yeah.
right? So I think the solution for that is just look for people that are relatable, that look not necessarily aspirational, but like humans that you vibe with, that
Yeah.
you are like, yeah, this is somebody that I feel like I would want to be their friend. I would want to be in that booth with her, talking to her. And
Yeah.
it doesn't necessarily need to be the person with the perfect blowout and pedicure and all that stuff like it was like 5 years ago. Um, I also think people that can bring an interesting POV or take, that's why again we fall back on like people that with experience, like in food service, or that used to be a waitress, or you see that all the time. People that used to be a
Hmm.
waitress, a bartender, blah 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 blah, and they've become an influencer because they do have a lot of insider and lived experience in the industry that they can, that they can bring to their content.